This is the story of my childhood. In August 1924, I was born Janet Patterson Frame. My twin, who was never named, died 2 weeks later.
Although Janet Frame is recognized as one of the most famous and successful New Zealand writers, the academic discussion around her, and more importantly, the number of people reading her, is scarce. Academics focus on her troubled life and mental health as the only narrow line of approach when dealing with her literary work. I think it is necessary to go beyond those arguments that constrain her possible readings to the private and personal sphere, and rediscover her as an author of complex universal ideas, beautiful language, and profound imagination. Let's talk about The Terrible Screaming and The Meatmaker's Office. Both short stories present an issue in communication. Screaming tells the story of how an incessant noise disrupts the life of an otherwise normal city, while in Meatmakers, the eponymous office decides to ban death via the prohibition of the word death itself. In both texts, there is an instance of disruption in the relation of signification and signal. Saussure defines the concepts sign, signification, and signal like follows. We propose to keep the term sign to designate a whole, but to replace concept and sound pattern, respectively, by signification and signal. So in Frame's stories, the linguistic signs death and the terrible screaming present a disconnection between their concept and their sound pattern, disconnection that is used to oppress. The narrators of both texts perform their narrative exercise as a frame to approach this disconnection inside the linguistic signs. In his concept of frame, Jacques Rancière proposes to break away from the old scheme of the identifying trouble, which is to find the same by moving to the place of the other. The question thus arises of a countermatch, discovering the other in the same, that is to say, referring to Wordsworth's verse, learning to miss one's way. Rancière's concepts central to my approach are the identifying trouble, understood in its broadest terms as a displacement not necessarily physical, the discovery of the other in the same as a new approach to identifying, and the same, that is the I, the frame from which any observer observes. In both stories, there are characters living in the fringes of the central society, in the otherness that the rim represents, but no entity is more distant than the two homodiegetic narrators. From their spatialization, they focalize in the characters and the actions, as a travel of the non-physical way. This represents the frame from which they are narrating. Studying their narrative exercise allows us to approach the issue of finding the other in the same, even when that same represents our own language. I argue that the two narrators are of homodiegetic nature. Luz Aurora Pimentel theorizes that what differentiates an homodiegetic narrator from a heterodiegetic one is the unfolding of the narrator as a narrative voice and as an actor in diegesis. Only the narrator in The Terrible Screaming recognizes a narratee. For you see, its name was Silence, Silence had found its voice. And that is sufficient to categorize her as homodiegetic, for, en estos casos, says Pimentel, debido a que yo y tú son solidarios, una narración en segunda persona implica necesariamente la presencia de un yo que narra, aun cuando ese yo no se enuncia directamente. To claim that the other narrator is homodiegetic as well, it is necessary to consider the metalinguistic and metafictional consequences of the important role of signs in both stories. By addressing the nature of words, both texts call attention to the very fabric that composes them. Form is linked to content, or in this case, the content goes back to the form. In Screaming, the renaming of the sound from Terrible Screaming to Silence is an action of the narrator, addressing the vis and beam of linguistic signs, always linking back to other signs, while the narrator of Meatmakers, on the other hand, writes the same word that is being banned in the diegesis she is narrating. To consider her inside of the same diegesis not only echoes one of the passages of the text, but also adds a layer to the prohibition of the word inside the story. Thus, the two acts of narration vindicate the use of language. One narrator is trying to assign the correct signal to a signification. The other is writing in actual physical paper, using the corporality of the real-world text, a prohibited signal. In Rancière's definition, this homadiegetic nature of the narrators places them in their space in relation to the story being told. The process of identification is first of all a process of spatialization. The paradox of identity is that you must travel to disclose it. The same can be recognized on condition that it be another. So the response to actions that try to destabilize their language is to try to make the same of this otherness. The first narrator declares, "For you see, its name was silence, silence had found its voice," naming that incessant noise not as the terrible screaming that the other characters ignore, but as the silence that finally speaks. The second narrator constantly rewrites the acoustic image dead, which has been censored by the authorities, rebelling against them. But both narrators encounter the walls of their own frame, in this case, language itself. By renaming the noise, the narrator only moves from one signifier to another, attempting to come closer to the signified. It is tautological. The trouble of the singularity of silence also arises. Which silence is she referring to? Which of the varied spectrum of signifiers that can be linked to this word? Is it the silence of the oppressed or the silence of the voiceless? The other narrator encounters a similar problem. The relation between a signifier and a signified is arbitrary, so to remove one from the equation leaves the other one meaningless. That becomes a shell in which every other censored word can enter, just like in the quote, "In books, the offending five-letter word was no longer written in full. Letters other than the first and last were replaced by dots or a dash." Any other five-letter word can be written over, or even worse, the rebellious use of the word is repurposed. In the end, a witness reminded the court, each one of us is involved in dying, and though we are forbidden by law to acknowledge this, surely it is necessary for us to learn the facts of death and burial? Rancière comments on this. Any production of meaning has to be taken as the expression of the spirit of a place, and the more wayward the production is, the more it has to be pinned down to the expression of a place. The best evidence of this is given by the way in which historians come to terms with heresy. Heresy means severance. It means a life divided, put out of its place, severed from itself by words. Now the turn of the historians of mentalities is dismissing the severance, giving heresy its place in the warmth of the village community. Heresy then becomes a culture of the village. This definition echoes the way the mythmaker censors death. "Ah," he said, "death is unmentionable. Surely that will please all concerned. Death is obscene, unpublishable." But when death is printed and defended in its value as a text, death then becomes a culture of the city. So both narrators travel and try to find the same by moving to the place of the other, to somewhat mixed results. But the other option is to crash with the limits of language and miscommunication. It seems like the narrators are confined to the arbitrariness of the sign and its simultaneous mutability and immutability. Let us explore then the option of the spoken word. Rancière exemplifies through the biblical narrative of the Word becoming flesh the dichotomy of the living Logos, which is endowed with the power of getting written in the very soul of he who receives it. On the other side, the dead letter, the written word, is like a painting, unable to give help to itself, unable to say but indefinitely the same thing. However, the problem in screaming is that the spoken word is already silenced when the terrible screaming becomes a written word in every character's mind, but no one utters it, reproducing the oppression. In myth-makers, the prohibition poses the same problem. The dead letter is what works when the living logos has been silenced. So the relationship between signification and signal is broken, as well as the living logos and the dead letter are constricted within the diegesis of these stories. To synthesize in both cases, to reconcile, seems to be the shift in the displacement that Rancière proposes to understand the binaries. Just as the linguistic relationship is corrupted and devoid of meaning when one of the terms is removed, the relation between the living and the dead logos is mutual. One needs the other and vice versa. But to synthesize is just another form of making same of the other. So to abandon the desire to synthesize is to start to learning to miss one's way. To recognize the bound of language inherent to the narrator's projects of reconstructing the relationship between signifier and signified brings the allowing of this disruption without making any effort to reconcile it. The narrators acknowledge the two instances of otherness in their own language, which I have already mentioned, the circularity and the arbitrariness of the linguistic signifier, which is an otherness because it sheds light on the limits of language, be it written or spoken, and the communication. The narrations use this finding of the other in the same to potentialize the disruption of the linguistic signs death and the terrible screaming. The terrible screaming becomes silence, and then silence acquires the interpretation that the reader has of it, again visualizing it from her or his own frame. In myth-makers, the ban of the one acoustic image brings forth the fatal consequence. Death, birth, life had been abolished. The frontier between the signals death and life blur because of the symbiosis between the concepts of death and life. So the linguistic sign is ever-changing and unstable in Janet Frames' stories, just like in language itself. However, the narrators do not attempt to reconcile the instability. They just present the possibilities. Silence, death, life, screaming, all of these are temporary substitutes for those unheard signs, and paradoxically, for a moment contains them all in the very act of narrating. It is only necessary to lose one's way.